Hello, my name's Osha. I like talking about American presidents. Today, I want to continue my discussion regarding uh, Thomas Jefferson's authorship of the Declaration of Independence. Now, of course, we've already talked about how this document is considered the apotheosis of political treatises. It's an excellent piece of literature. I've discussed how I love the language, the fact that it is it's clear, it's got it's for its clarity and its simplicity, and it's succinct. So it's concise, very accessible, very easy to understand. And even though it was written about almost 250 years ago, it's still very easy to understand, and it's still relatable today. It's romantically written, right? It's romantic. It's romantic literature, but it's not verbose. It's not too flowery, even for those times. Of course, that was before the Victorian era. During the Victoria era, language became more wordy. In the manner and the style of Charles Dickens, who's my favorite author, by the way. But so I want to use the opportunity to get into language, discuss language. So we find that even though we were breaking away from England, remember our founding fathers, the framers were Englishmen, and they were breaking away from England. Something that they retained was the English language, which we still speak today in America. In fact, was it March the 1st, 2025, President Donald Trump, the incumbent president, he issued an executive order 14224, which officially designated English as the official language. Of course, because it's an executive order, it's non-binding. It only applies to federal agencies. Because it's not in our constitution, right? It's not in our constitution to that English is our official language. It's not in the U.S. Constitution, and this invokes the 10th Amendment. Now, I've discussed the 10th Amendment before. The 10th Amendment, that's if I can recall it, but it goes like this. That's uh, powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, uh, you know, will be, are reserved, are reserved to the states, respectively, or to the people. So the language is one of those things. The establishment of an official language is one of those things that it invokes Article 10. Sorry, the 10th Amendment applies, so it's under the purview of the states. So we do have about 32 states in the United States that have designated English as the official or a co-official language. I know the state of Hawaii has English, English and something else as an official language. So 32 states. Um, in the U.S. Constitution, even though we don't have it in the U.S. Constitution that English is our official language, it's remained our official language de facto. It's a de facto language, and of course, so that's why I want to get into the English language. Now, other things, of course, that the last video I did, I was talking about the social hierarchy, the nobility within the English system in the form of government and the social, political, socio-economic structure that has an entrenched nobility and heritable titles, inherited rank and titles like the dukes, the barons, which still exist in England today. Now, that was prohibited in our constitution, right? In Article 1, Section 9, titles of nobility are expressly prohibited, and by are expressly prohibited to the federal government from granting. The federal government cannot grant titles of nobility. They can't create titles of nobility, and for the states as well. Article 1, Section 10, prevents the states from, establishing titles of nobility. So the idea is we don't want aristocratic systems. We don't want inherited rank. We don't want status to, people to have status by birth. And so we wanted to create a meritocracy. We wanted people to achieve, their positions by merit. That was the idea in our constitution. I'll get back to that again, do a subsequent video and talk about the social structure again. Now, remember the people in the House of Commons in England, the burgesses, the middle class people, the mercantile people, those who were now the new people making money, by exerting themselves, right? These were the people that we had in America. People like Thomas Jefferson, they were not people, they didn't have the inherited nobility. So that was something that's is set in stone. It's fixed in our constitution. But regarding language, the constitution is silent regarding language. But English has remained our de facto official language, all right, even since our breakup. And we've gone to do so much great things with the English language, right? We've created, we've had people who've won Nobel Prizes in literature, people like Ernest Hemingway. I've read Hemingway, and John, is it Steinbeck, the guy who wrote Of Mice and Men, Grapes of Wrath, Steinbeck, many Nobel laureates in literature that we have, we've had in America. So that's why I think it's appropriate. What I want to do now is go into the history of the English language. How did the English language come about? It's something we as Americans we've inherited from England, and I think it's worthy, especially since we keep praising the writing of Thomas Jefferson so much. Thomas Jefferson, of course, had a mastery of the English language. He had an interesting book in his library called, Samuel Johnson's Dictionary of the English Language, which was, it was an epical book. It was a watershed, new seminal work. I guess that was the first dictionary of the English language. And Samuel Johnson was a writer, and of course, he also wrote like a collection of Shakespeare's works. That's Samuel Johnson, and these books were in Thomas Jefferson's library. Of course, Thomas Jefferson had the largest library in the Americas, in North America, and he donated its bulk. That's about 6,487 volumes to the Library of Congress after the library's collection was burned in the War of 1812. I think it was burned, in 1814. So, how did the English language come about? Again, the English, of course, we go back into the history, right? The British, the English, they came originally. There were the Celts who were there. We talked about the Roman era, right? The Romans were there until 410 AD. Of course, the Roman had their Latin, their Latin language, which, it transferred a lot into technical works, scientific works. Latin is the language of the Roman Catholic Church. It became the language of the mathematicians, the scientists. But when the Romans were in Britain, the Celts, yes, they acquired some. The Celts were the original inhabitants. You can call them the Aboriginals, at least before the Romans, the Roman conquest of Britain, which was from about 43 AD to 410 AD. The Celts had their language, and what the Celts spoke, the Celtic language is sort of what Wales, they still speak that today in Wales. But of course, some Latin phrases, Latin words, went into were acquired by the Britons, including words like mile, wall, certain certain cheese, wine. These are words that were they were acquired from the Romans, because the Romans spoke Latin. Now, so the Romans left in 410, and then there were now new settlers, new people who invaded. They came to settle down, and these were Germanic tribes: the Angles, the Jutes, and the Saxons. They came from uh, northern Germany, the area today that's northern Germany, and Denmark. So these were known as, so they were Germanic tribes. They came from that area, and that's the Angles, the Jutes, and the Saxons. So they settled in the area that came to be England. They mixed, right? They had their different languages and culture, and so they mixed. And over time, so they arrived about in the fifth century, right? The fifth century, they mixed. After some centuries, of mixing together, they developed what came to be known as Old English, right? Old English. And that language is gibberish to us today. It's incomprehensible. It's not spoken. So they developed what's called Old English. So that's between 500 AD to 1100 AD. So that was the period of Old English. That language is not it's not comprehensible to us. But interesting literature came from that era. Uh, if you studied literature in school, most English speakers know the book Beowulf. It's an epic poem. It's called Beowulf. So Beowulf was developed during that time. I read Beowulf in school, of course, a translated version. A translated version. The original version, I have excerpts. It's not understandable. I've seen excerpts, and uh, so from Old English, there's certain words, right, that's we know came from Old English, and they've transferred into the modern English language that we have. For instance, loaf, right? Loaf was a laugh. There's certain words that come from Old English, and loaf, today, sell, sile. Of course, they went in the same way, so they've changed in form. Forgive, it was forgive. Certain words, came from that Old English, right? And but if the language is spoken today, it's incomprehensible. But certain words got transferred from Old English, and so that was the era of Old English. Was developed, and that was between 500 and 1100. Now, there was now what was called the Norman invasion, right? The Norman invasion came with the conquest of William the Conqueror, who was, he was French. His ancestors, of course, they originally were Vikings, but they settled in Normandy. Normandy is in France, and they adopted the French culture, so they spoke French. So they were French people. They became French. They were acculturated as French people, and so they invaded and conquered England, and they established. They did away with the Anglo-Saxon leadership, that they met there, and they now became the upper class, the elites. They established the aristocracy, right? That's William the Conqueror and his barons, his nobles. And so they created that hierarchical aristocratic structure that was based on land and the military. I've discussed this, and I'm going to do a subsequent video. So they spoke the language of court, and the language they spoke then was French, right? They spoke Norman French. So it's an old form of French language. And from that interaction, from that conquest, they were there. We find they brought a lot into the English language that we know. So about 28% of the English language, consequently, as a result of the Norman invasion and the Norman settling and the entrenchment of the Norman French, 28% of the English language is actually French today. It's Old Norman French. So that's makes up about 28% of it, of the English language. So but prior to that, there was other subsequent invasions, right? The Vikings came around between the 8th and 9th century. Then missionaries, when England was now Christianized, right? It was converted to Christianity by the missionaries. They brought Latin, and so they brought more Latin words. And that's the interesting thing about the Anglo-Saxon language, the English language, which came to be known as the English language. It's very adaptable. It embraces. It's like an umbrella language. It infuses new language and it adapts. So this is something that kept going on in the English language, and I guess because of that adaptability, English is actually the most widely spoken language in the world today. English language is the most widely spoken language in the world. It is also the most widely spoken second language. So most speakers of the English language are not native speakers. So the native speakers of the English language are the third, they're the third because of course the large uh, uh, native spoken language would be, I guess, Chinese, and then Spanish, is second, and then English third. But as a second language and just being spoken as a lingua franca, as an official language, English is the most widely spoken language in the world today. And I guess that's because of its ability to adapt, its adaptability. So, of course, English is the lingua franca of businesses, of many international organizations. And of course, that's also attributable to what would come later on. England established the largest empire, British Empire, the largest empire by territory, right? Even larger than the Roman Empire. So the Roman Empire is known for having longest had the longest tenure, the longest lifespan, right, over 1,000 years. But in terms of territorial extent, it didn't match the British Empire. So in terms, the British Empire came to cover about a quarter of the world land mass and population. So of course, because of that, I guess it spread. English spread widely as well. English as a spoken language. So by the time of so when the Vikings came about the ninth century. So the Vikings came from the area of Scandinavia. Today, those who were they're also called the Norsemen. That's the area of Sweden, Denmark. So the English are cousins of the Danes. Sweden, Denmark, Iceland, Norway. So the Norwegians, so that was the area where the Vikings came, and so the Vikings, when they came with their new invasion in about the ninth century, they brought words, their own words. So in fact, uh, the influence of the Norse language, which was called the Old Norse, the language of the Vikings or the Old Norse, the influence of their language is seen today in the days of the week, right? So they had the names of their Germanic gods, right? So we know of Tuesday, that's Twi, right? Their Germanic god Twi, Tuesday. Woden, that's Wednesday. Thurin, or Thor, Thurn, Thursday. Frag, right? That's Friday. So that's the Old Norse influence. They also brought certain adaptations, certain new words into the English language, like law, right? The Old Norse is log. So law its root is from the Old Norse, that's log. Log means fixed, something's fixed or something laid down. So law, and which is very significant for me. So law, that's from the Vikings, from the Old Norse. And of course, it became Anglo-Saxon. And just because by the time the French came, the Normans came, right, and they were ruling and they had the aristocracy, parallel English was sort of there was a parallel language that was developing. So the language of the elite and the court and the government was the Norman French, right, the Old French. That was from about 1100 until the 14th century, about the 11th century until the 14th century, while the language of the the common people spoke the Old English, that was what the Beowulf, the book Beowulf was written in. So they spoke the Old English. And so you see, there were parallel languages that were developing in England at the time. And that's why England apparently has the most synonyms in any language, right? The same term or the same meaning, the same can have different words. And because of the parallel uh, development of the English language, where the Norman French was spoken in the courts, right, and spoken by the elites, while the peasantry or the ordinary people, the common people, were speaking Old English, right? The Anglo-Saxon. Um, an example is like lawyer, right? I'm a lawyer, and you see the differences also in the distinctions in meaning. I'm a lawyer. I normally explain to people that, right, attorneys are lawyers, but not all lawyers are attorneys. All attorneys are lawyers because an attorney in the US can practice. His license called to the bar to practice, to actually represent someone. But a lawyer, uh, somebody who's trained in the law, they're experts. And you see it in the meaning. It's actually in the old meaning. So lawyer is Anglo-Saxon. It's Old English. Lawita came from log, the old Norse language. So lawyer is lawita. That means uh, someone who is wise, a wise man in the law, right? A wise man in the law. That's lawita. That's where lawyer, the term comes from. But attorney comes from Norman French, Old French. Attorney comes from, right? Attorney, that's attorney. And that means someone who, to act for someone else, someone who speaks for someone else, to assign, someone who's appointed to represent someone else. That's what attorney means. And, it retains its meaning today, right? An attorney can actually represent a client because they're licensed to practice. So they're actually practicing and representing someone else. Um, Interestingly, of course, Latin, which about 28% of the English language has Latin roots, right? Uh, the Latin form um, of lawyer, or the equivalent, the synonym is advocate, right? Its root is Latin advocatus, that's to aid, right? To call to aid, right? That's advocate, advocatus. So you see, English, it has so many synonyms. It has the most synonyms. It's said to have the most synonyms of any language because of the parallel growth. So you see, another distinction, that we see is in the food, right? The animals that were prepared, that were bred, right, that were domesticated to be eaten. So we see a distinction between in language, in the people who prepared the food, right, and the elite who actually ate the food, right. So take for example, the origin of these, the origin of chicken, chicken, cow, uh, chicken, cow, pig. They have Old English roots, Anglo-Saxon, right? The farmers who actually prepared the food, who bred them, who prepared the food, who cultivated them, domesticated them. Those are the farmers, the language of the ordinary people, the peasants, those people who uh, uh, raised the animals. And then it had its French equivalent, right? So pig from Anglo-Saxon is pork, which is French. It's Old French. The elite who ate it, so it was, they called it pork. That's French. Um, Cow, that's Old English. The Anglo-Saxons, the peasant class, the lower class, the farmers who raised the animal, who prepared it, and then the elite, the aristocratic, the elite Norman French called it beef. The people who ate it, right? And you had chicken, Old English, Anglo-Saxon English, and then you had poultry, French, the Norman French. So you see these parallel, the synonyms and the parallel language that was developing. However, after about a couple of about 100 years or so, the language fused together, right? The language would fuse together. Uh, and about 14th century, we finally, I mean, England, I said we, England finally had an English speaker, because, again, the kings and the nobles, those ruling England at the time, were Norman French. They were French, right? And they spoke French. It was the language of court. And of course, so the language of governance, right, was French, was Norman French. So we see words that actually came from the Norman French. In fact, parliament came from the French, Norman French. Parliament, council, justice, jury, clergy, sermon, all these came from the Norman French. The language of it was the language of courts, governance. So that was the how uh, it was the language of the elite, of the upper class. Now, interestingly, there was a parallel estate that was developing, even though you had the nobility, the courts, and the nobility, and you also had the clergy, right? So the clergy spoke Latin, right? They spoke Latin because of the Roman Catholic Church, and you see till today the Roman Catholic Church still uses Latin as its official language. Um, so after up until about the 14th century, I think it was 1367, about 14th century, England now had an English speaker as king, right? And so the language of court changed. So English was introduced in Parliament in about the 14th century, about something about 1367, and Henry IV was an English speaker. So you see, the language started to change, and so from about 1100 to 1500, that was what the English evolved and became into Middle English, what's called Middle English, and the literature of that time. I remember I had it on my shelf in my home at the time. Geoffrey Chaucer's the Canterbury Tales, right? Geoffrey Chaucer's the Canterbury Tales that reflected Middle English. All right, that reflected Middle English, and by Middle English, the term, for instance, for lawyer had already started to evolve, right? So I think it was lager, so it started to evolve better. So the language was starting to change. Now, the language that we know today, though, the language that's more familiar to us today, is early modern English, and this came about from 1500, so 1500 to 1700. So this is a language that our founding fathers were familiar with and would have started speaking. The language of Shakespeare, William Shakespeare. So that's English as we know it today. Maybe it's a little bit more verbose, but so the language our founding fathers spoke, it had evolved from 1500, which is 16th century, to 1700 or 1800. So that was the early modern English. And one of the things, apart from the author, the writer, William Shakespeare, he introduced many new words. So he said there's no individual that introduced more words than William Shakespeare into the English language, right? And so we all know Romeo and Juliet, much ado about nothing. He invented a lot of words. At least he wrote down a lot of words. Maybe they were in use, but they hadn't been written down. He wrote a lot of these words down, and we all know Romeo and Juliet, Merchants of Venice. I read tons of his works. When I was a kid. Richard II. He wrote Julius Caesar. Many, many different. He put uh, uh, he put words into Julius Caesar himself, right? When Julius Caesar was being assassinated, in fact, assassinated is a word invented by William Shakespeare, created by William Shakespeare. So when he was being assassinated by Brutus, remember he's supposed to have said "E tu Brute," you too Brutus. Of course, that's a Latin version. So again, remember, Latin was also continued to be learned as well, because Latin was the language of scholars. So even our founding fathers, they wrote Latin, they learned Latin, the classics. But so because and during the era of the early modern English from 1500, that was also the period of the Renaissance in Italy, the Italian Renaissance, and it affected the English language. So new words, scientific words like encyclopedia, philosophy, these came into the English language, and so more Latin words came in, and Greek words as well, because the scientific the language of science was mainly in Greek and Latin. So this expanded the English vocabulary. Now, something else that happened, they call it the Great Vowel Shift, right? So pronunciation started to shift dramatically into what we know today. An example of that great vowel shift, they say a diphthong, right? It's called a diphthong. An example of a diphthong, okay. See, for instance, let me give an example. Knife, right? Knife is something that is a word that came from the Vikings, right? So the Vikings brought violent words, where uh, uh, slaughter, berserk, right? Ransack. Those were words that came from the Vikings, right? The Vikings, in when they invaded around about the ninth and 10th century, right? So another word they brought also was knife. Now in Middle English, knife was pronounced knife, and it was spelled right with a double E. And the K, right? If you spell knife today, it's spelled Knife. So it would be written as Kneef, and it was pronounced Knief, right? Neef. So the great vowel shift, the double E would be dropped for I, and the K would be removed, would not be pronounced. So knife. So we don't pronounce the K when we pronounce knife. Uh, Something else, the word bite today is spelled Bite. During the Middle English, in Middle